In September 1647, a man named Murrough O'Brien arrived at the gates of the Rock of Cashel with an army and a very specific mandate. The rock had been a sacred site for over 1,000 years. St. Patrick was said to have baptized the first Christian king of Munster on it. Brian Boru, the most celebrated king in Irish history, had been crowned there twice. Cormac's Chapel, the finest piece of Romanesque architecture in Ireland, had been consecrated on it in 1134. The Gothic cathedral that towered above the surrounding plain had served as the seat of the archbishops of Cashel for 4 centuries. Murrough O'Brien burned it anyway. Not the buildings, those were too large and too stone to burn, though he tried. He burned the town around the rock. He massacred the garrison. He killed the clergy he found inside. He desecrated the cathedral. He smashed the statues. He took the vestments and the chalices and the sword and mace of the mayor of Cashel and the coach of the bishop, and he plundered everything of value inside one of the chief holy places of Ireland. The slaughter was, according to contemporary accounts, the worst single atrocity committed in Ireland since the fighting of 1641 had begun. O'Brien's reputation for this, and for what he did to the surrounding Munster countryside, burning towns, destroying crops, killing civilians, earned him the Irish nickname Perched na Doitein, Murrough of the Burnings. He was a member of the O'Brien family, descended from Brian Boru himself, fighting against the Catholic Irish Confederates as a Protestant Parliamentarian. He was burning the sacred sites of the dynasty he descended from. But the 1647 massacre is only one of the dark chapters of the Rock of Cashel's history. Before that, there was the political calculation behind the gift of the rock to the church in 1101, a donation that was simultaneously an act of religious generosity and a piece of ruthless dynastic politics designed to prevent a rival family from ever claiming their ancestral throne again. Before that, there was the long rule of the Oganacht dynasty, and then the Dal Kais, the Vikings who occupied the town at the foot of the rock, the synods that divided and reorganized the Irish Church, the Norman arrival that changed everything, the building campaigns that created the extraordinary architectural complex that still crowns the limestone outcrop today. And underneath all of it, before the Christians, before the kings, before the saint with his crozier, there is the devil. According to local tradition, he bit a chunk out of a mountain 20 miles north of Cashel and spat it southward, and the rock that fell became the Rock of Cashel. St. Patrick chased him to it. The legend is not history, but it captures something true about this place. It has always been a site of extremity, of the most intense human activities, power, sanctity, violence, carried out at the highest possible register. This is the history of the Rock of Cashel, all of it, from the devil's geological contribution to the archbishop's preference for central heating. Chapter 1. The Limestone Rock and the World Before the Kings, Prehistory to 300 A.D. The Rock of Cashel is a natural limestone outcrop rising approximately 60 meters above the surrounding plain of County Tipperary in the Irish province of Munster. The Grokopedia description situates it precisely, an archaeological complex perched on a natural limestone outcrop in County Tipperary, Ireland. The rock itself, a long, irregular knoll of grey Carboniferous limestone, emerges from the Golden Vale, one of the most fertile agricultural landscapes in Ireland, with a combination of visual drama and geological distinctiveness that made it conspicuous in its landscape long before anyone built anything on it. The name Cashel derives from the Irish word caesile, which itself comes from the Latin castellum, fortress. The name implies that the first structure on the rock was a stone ring fort, a cashel, of the type that Irish communities had been building since the Iron Age. Stone ring forts were a characteristic form of high-status enclosure in early medieval Ireland. Circular walls of dry stone construction, often used to enclose the residence of a local lord or king. At Cashel, the rock itself provided much of the defensive circuit, and a Cashel on its summit would have been among the most naturally secure sites in Munster. The legend of Iontai, the rock's origin, is the best-known piece of its prehistory. St. Patrick, according to tradition, encountered the devil in Ireland and gave chase. The devil was hiding in a cave in a mountain called the Devil's Bit, approximately 20 miles north of Cashel. In one version, the devil bit into the mountain in rage. In another, he attempted to drop the boulder on Patrick himself. The Devil's Bit mountain, still visible on the horizon north of Cashel, with its distinctive notch, is the physical evidence that the legend is responding to. There really is a gap in the ridge, and the limestone outcrop at Cashel does correspond, in approximate geological terms, to the kind of fragment that such a mountain might have shed. However many millions of years before Patrick's time, the actual geological event occurred. A 2015 geophysical survey identified subsurface anomalies suggestive of early medieval enclosure, physical evidence for the rock's pre-Christian occupation, alongside the broader pattern of early Irish sacred sites. High, prominent features in the Irish landscape, hills, outcrops, rivers, were the locations of pre-Christian ritual practice, and the Rock of Cashel's visual dominance over the surrounding plain made it the kind of place that Iron Age communities would have used for assembly, for ceremony, for the inauguration of rulers. The word Munster itself originates from the Gaelic god Muman. The province was named for a deity. The land was sacred in a specific pre-Christian sense that the later Christian appropriation of its sacred sites would build on rather than replace. The specific character of the Cashel Rock as a pre-Christian sacred site is suggested by the pattern of landscape use across Iron Age and early medieval Ireland. Prominent hills, rocky outcrops, river confluences, and other distinctive natural features were the physical locations of the Tuath, the basic unit of Irish political and sacred organization, the tribe's territory defined by its landmarks. The assembly place, Oinak, where a tribe gathered for political decisions, legal proceedings, and seasonal festivals, would typically be a prominent natural feature. The Rock of Cashel, rising from the plain, visible from a great distance, accessible from multiple directions, was the obvious Oinak for the tribes of the Cashel region. A 2015 geophysical survey, part of the Defining the Rock of Cashel project led by Patrick Gleeson, identified subsurface structures below the medieval buildings, confirming that the site's complete history is considerably larger than the standing buildings suggest. The buried evidence may eventually clarify how the site was used before the Yoganacht dynasty made it their royal seat, and whether the Cashel tradition of stone ring fort construction was active here before or during the pre-Christian period. The Golden Vale that stretches around the rock, one of the most fertile agricultural landscapes in Ireland, the basis for Tipperary's modern dairy industry, as well as its medieval agricultural wealth, gives the rock its specific political rationale. A king whose seat was on a prominent rock overlooking the most productive land in Munster was a king who visibly commanded the wealth that sustained his kingdom. The rock did not need to be agriculturally productive itself, it needed to be visible from the land that was, and to command the routes through that land. Cashel's position does both. Chapter 2. The Eoganacht Dynasty and the Foundation of the Kingdom, 300 to 900 A.D. The Eoganacht Dynasty, the first great ruling family of Munster, claimed the Rock of Cashel as their royal seat from approximately the 4th or 5th century A.D. Tradition holds that in the 4th century, the Eoganachta clan chose the Rock of Cashel as their base after arriving from Wales, though whether that origin is historical or a later genealogical invention of the kind that early medieval Irish dynasties frequently constructed to legitimate their claims is a matter for specialists to debate. What is not disputed is that from roughly the 4th century onward, the Rock of Cashel was the principal royal seat of the Kingdom of Munster. It is documented that in its earliest form, Cashel was the seat of power and main residence of the kings of Munster. Though that documentation is largely post-factual, the medieval annals compiled centuries after the events. The consistency of the tradition and the archaeological evidence for high-status occupation make the claim credible. The most famous episode of the Iogonacht period at Cashel is the baptism of King Angus mac Nad Froich by St. Patrick, a story that exists in multiple versions with varying details but consistent significance. According to tradition, St. Patrick baptized Conall Cork's grandson, Angus mac Nad Froich, at Cashel. During the ceremony, Patrick accidentally pierced Angus's foot with his crosier. Believing it to be part of the ritual, Angus endured it in silence, and he would later be remembered as the first Christian king of Munster. The story of Patrick's crosier piercing the king's foot is one of the most charming episodes in the legendary history of Irish Christianity. Its structural function is to establish Angus as the first Christian king through an act of stoic endurance that prefigures the martyrdom of the Christian saints. He bears the pain in silence because he believes it to be the appropriate response to divine ceremony, a patient suffering for God that the king performs even before he fully understands Christian theology. The story is almost certainly legendary rather than historical. St. Patrick's biography is itself poorly documented enough that the specific encounter with Angus cannot be verified. But it established a specific tradition of Christian identity for Cashel and for Munster that shaped all subsequent development of the site. The Iogonacht dynasty ruled Munster from Cashel for several centuries, until the 10th century, when the rock was lost to the rising Dalkais dynasty under Brian Boru. The transition from Iogonacht to Dalkais ownership was not peaceful or voluntary. It was the product of the same violent dynastic competition that characterized Irish political life throughout this period. The Vikings were part of this story. Brian's brother Mathghamhain captured the rock in 968 from the Vikings, who had themselves taken it from the Iogonacht, a sequence of displacement, Iogonacht displaced by Vikings, Vikings displaced by the rising Dalkais under Mathghamhain, places the Rock of Cashel within the most turbulent phase of Irish political history, the period of Viking settlement and the Irish kingdom's responses to that settlement. The Viking presence in Munster was centered primarily on the coastal cities they founded: Limerick at the mouth of the Shannon, Waterford at the mouth of the Suir and Barrow, Cork at the mouth of the Lee. From these bases, Viking forces penetrated inland along the river systems, raiding the monasteries and political centers of the Irish kingdoms. Cashel, on its prominent rock in the middle of the Golden Vale, was both a target worth raiding and a defensive position worth holding. The episode in which Vikings occupied the rock before being expelled by Mathghamhain is a small piece of the larger story of Irish resistance to and accommodation of the Viking presence. The Iogonacht dynasty's long tenure at Cashel had given the rock a specific character as a site of legitimation, the place where kings of Munster were made, where the ceremonies of inaugurations and assemblies took place, where the sacred and the political were most concentrated in a single location. The loss of this seat to the Dalkais dynasty under Mathghamhain and Brian was therefore not merely a political defeat, but a ritual one. The Iogonacht had lost the place where their kingship was performed and confirmed. When Brian Boru's descendants eventually gave the rock to the church in 1101, ensuring that the Iogonacht could never reclaim it, they were completing what Mathghamhain had begun, permanently displacing the oldest dynasty in Munster from the site that had defined their authority for 5 centuries. The memory of the Huguenot, however, did not disappear. In the form of the MacCarthy dynasty, descendants of Cormac MacCarthy, who ruled Desmond, southern Munster, through the medieval period, the Huguenot line persisted as a political force in Munster. Cormac MacCarthy's decision to build his chapel on the rock in 1127 was the most eloquent possible expression of this persistent memory. The family had been displaced from their ancestral seat a century and a half earlier, but they had not forgotten where their kingship had been performed, and the chapel was their declaration that the memory was still alive. Chapter 3. Brian Boru and the High Kingship, the Rock. At its secular peak, 900 to 1014, Brian Boru is the most celebrated figure in Irish medieval history, and his connection to the Rock of Cashel is fundamental to the site's historical significance. He was born into the Dalkais dynasty in approximately 941, the son of Senetig mac Lorcain, king of the Dalkais. His rise to power followed the standard pattern of Irish dynastic politics in this period: conflict, alliance, assassination, and the accumulation of military victories that established the right to rule. Mathcamhain captured the rock in 968, became king of Munster, and was assassinated by rival chieftains in 976. Brian succeeded him, avenged his murder, and began the expansion of Dalkais power. The assassination of Mathcamhain by rival chieftains in 976 was a standard mechanism of Irish dynastic transition. Killing a rival king was both more efficient than defeating him militarily and more permanent than any political agreement. Brian succeeded his brother, avenged his murder, as the annals record, and began the expansion of Dalkais power that would eventually make him the most powerful king in Irish history. Brian was inaugurated as King of Munster at the Rock of Cashel in 978. The ceremony would have taken place at the summit of the rock, the natural platform that the limestone outcrop provided, elevated above the surrounding plain, visible for miles in every direction. The specific ceremony involved, traditionally, the Leafale, the Stone of Destiny, or a local equivalent, and the Rock of Cashel had its own legendary coronation stone. According to legend, the coronation stone of Cashel would scream with joy when the rightful king sat upon it, and it screamed during Brian's coronation in 1002. From Munster, Brian extended his power northward. By 997 he had taken the whole of southern Ireland from the High King Mael Sechlainn II. By 1002 he was acclaimed High King of Ireland at Tara, the traditional centre of Irish high kingship, making him the first king of Munster ever to hold this position. In 1002 he was the first king of Munster to become High King of Ireland. The Rock of Cashel was not merely the seat of a provincial king, it was, from 1002 onward, the home fortress of the man who had unified Ireland under a single rule for the first time. Brian's achievement in unifying Ireland was unprecedented and unrepeated. Brian Boru was, by Irish tradition, the only High King to unify the whole island of Ireland under one rule. Whether this claim is historically precise or somewhat exaggerated by national tradition is debated, but the scale of his achievement, consolidating power across the island's warring kingdoms, bringing the Norse cities of Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick into at least nominal submission, maintaining the unity long enough to demonstrate it was possible, was real and remarkable. His death at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 was the defining tragedy of early medieval Irish history. Brian was killed not in the fighting itself, but in his tent afterward, by a fleeing Norse warrior named Brodar, who had somehow penetrated the camp. He was 73 years old. He had spent decades fighting to create an Ireland that would last beyond him, and his death ensured that it did not. The annals record that his body was carried from Clontarf to Armagh for burial, a journey of almost 150 miles, in a procession that commemorated his achievement and his death simultaneously. The Rock of Cashel, as Brian Boru had left it, was still a royal fortress, still the seat of the kings of Munster. The buildings on it were the stone cashel of the ring fort tradition, not the elaborate ecclesiastical complex that would develop in the 12th century. No trace of the structures from Brian's era survives above ground. The absence of surviving pre-1101 structures is itself historically significant. The ring fort, the cashel for which the rock is named, was almost certainly still standing when Murrough donated the rock to the church in 1101. The subsequent building program, Round Tower, then Cathedral, then Cormac's Chapel, then the 13th century Gothic rebuild, progressively covered and replaced the earlier structures, until nothing of the pre-Christian or early Christian settlement remained above ground. The Rock of Cashel is, in this sense, a site where the later buildings have consumed their predecessors entirely. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 has been mythologized in Irish national tradition as the moment when Brian Boru saved Ireland from Viking conquest. The historical reality is more nuanced. The Battle of Clontarf was a complex engagement between Brian's forces and a coalition that included both Norse Vikings and Irish kings who had opposed Brian's high kingship. It was not a simple battle between the Irish and the Vikings, and its result, however significant Brian's death, did not end Viking influence in Ireland. The Norse cities of Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick continued as centres of trade and culture for centuries afterward, their residents becoming increasingly integrated into Irish society through intermarriage and cultural exchange. But the death of Brian Boru at Clontarf was genuinely significant for the Rock of Cashel. It ended the period of Dalcase dominance that had brought the family from the banks of the Shannon to the high kingship of Ireland in less than a century. Brian's successors, his son Donnchad and his grandson Toerdlbach, maintained a degree of Dalcase power, but the unified high kingship that Brian had constructed was not preserved. The period between Brian's death in 1014 and the Norman invasion in 1169 was one of continued competition between the major dynasties, O'Brien, MacCarthy, O'Connor, for dominance that none of them managed to make permanent. Cashel remained the seat of the kings of Munster, but the kings of Munster no longer had the uncontested authority that Brian had briefly held. Murrough decision to give the rock to the church in 1101 was partly a response to this political instability. Unable to guarantee that his dynasty would maintain the rock indefinitely against MacCarthy competition, he chose to make it unavailable to everyone, rather than risk losing it to a rival. Chapter 4. The Gift That Changed Everything. Murrough gives the rock to the church, 1101. In 1101, the Rock of Cashel was given to the church. This act, simultaneously the most famous and the most calculated event in the rock's history, transformed the site from a royal fortress into an ecclesiastical center that would accumulate its remarkable collection of medieval buildings over the following centuries. The person who made the gift was Murrough O'Brien, grandson of Brian Boru and King of Munster. The gift was, in the most pointed reading of his motivation, not primarily religious generosity, but competitive politics. Murrough was donating the rock specifically to prevent his rivals from ever claiming it. This interpretation, the gift as a weapon against the Eogannacht, as much as an act of generosity toward the church, is consistent with the political context. The Eogannacht dynasty, whose name was now represented primarily by the MacCarthy family, MacCarthay, had held the rock for 600 years before the Dalcase displaced them. Their claim to Cashel was the most legitimate claim in Munster. The rock was their ancestral seat, the place where their kings had been inaugurated, the site of the earliest Christian ceremony of their dynasty. If the McCarthys recovered their power, as they subsequently did, they would have an overwhelming claim to the rock. Giving it to the church made that claim politically toxic. A king who tried to seize a site that had been donated to the church by the High King of Ireland would be defying the ecclesiastical authority that his own power depended on for legitimacy. Muirchertach was a man with an unusually sophisticated understanding of the church's growing institutional power. The synod at Rathbrasil in 1111, which met at Cashel and which divided Ireland into territorial dioceses for the first time, was a measure of how completely the gift of 1101 had transformed the rock's institutional significance. From a royal fortress, it became the seat of an archbishopric that rivaled Armagh in its authority over the southern half of Ireland. A round tower was erected shortly after the donation, the first of the rock's surviving medieval buildings. The tower, one of the most distinctive forms of early medieval Irish architecture, a slender cylinder of stone rising 28 meters to its conical cap, dating from shortly after 1101, was the first of the rock's surviving medieval buildings. The tower served simultaneously as a bell tower, a treasury, and a place of refuge. In an era when monastic sites were routinely raided, the ability to ring a bell from the top of a 28-meter tower to warn of approaching raiders, and then to withdraw valuables and personnel to a space accessible only from a high entrance, was practically valuable. Only the tower's conical roof has been rebuilt in the 19th century. The rest of the structure is original. Chapter 5. Cormac's Chapel and the Romanesque Revolution, 1111 to 1134. The Synod of Rathbrasil in 1111, held at Cashel, formally established the ecclesiastical geography of medieval Ireland. 2 provinces, 2 archbishoprics, Armagh in the north, Cashel in the south, and a network of territorial dioceses that gave the church a structural claim over every part of the island. In 1111, Cashel became the seat of an archbishop, one of only 2 in Ireland, the other being Armagh. The Rock of Cashel was now not only a holy site, but a center of administrative power equivalent to the most ancient ecclesiastical institution in Ireland. This elevation of Cashel's ecclesiastical status coincided with a remarkable political circumstance. The McCarthy family, the Oganacht descendants, who had been displaced from Cashel by Brian Boru's dynasty and then prevented from reclaiming it by the 1101 donation, had consolidated their rule over Desmond, the southern portion of Munster, and were once again one of the most powerful dynasties in the province. Cormac MacCarthay, king of Desmond, began building his chapel on the rock in 1127. Cormac MacCarthay was making a statement of power by building his royal chapel after his family's 150-year absence from the rock. The chapel that Cormac MacCarthay built between 1127 and 1134 is the most important building on the Rock of Cashel in architectural terms, and possibly the most important surviving piece of Romanesque architecture in Ireland. Cormac's chapel is the finest, most complete, and probably the earliest Romanesque church in Ireland. The Romanesque architectural style, characterized by round arches, elaborate sculptural decoration, and a specific system of surface articulation using blind arcading, carved corbels, and decorated doorways, had arrived in Ireland in the early 12th century, and Cormac's Chapel was one of the first significant expressions of this continental style on Irish soil. The building shows Germanic influences in its twinned towers at the junction of nave and chancel. Cashel had strong links with the German town of Regensburg at this time. The Irish abbot of Regensburg, Dirmitius, sent 2 of his carpenters to help with the building, a specific act of architectural assistance that explains why the twin towers flanking the nave-chancel junction are so distinctively un-Irish in their form. The result is a building that fuses Irish Romanesque tradition with continental, specifically German, architectural innovation. The tympanum of the north doorway shows a lion, a centaur with a bow, and a helmet in the Norman style, carved nearly 40 years before the Norman invasion. The most likely explanation is that Norman stonemasons worked on the chapel. Norman masons at Cashel 40 years before the Norman conquest of Ireland. If this interpretation is correct, it represents the first physical encounter of Norman architectural culture with the Irish royal tradition. 4 decades before that encounter became political and military. The frescoes that covered Cormac's chapel from floor to ceiling in its choir were, at the time of their painting in the mid-12th century, the most elaborate decorative scheme in any Irish building. The wall paintings in the chancel, the oldest Romanesque frescoes in Ireland, depicting scenes from the early life of Christ, were whitewashed at the Reformation and remained hidden until the 1980s. 6 centuries of whitewash preserved them. The discovery in the 1980s allowed conservation work that has partially stabilized but not fully revealed the original scheme. Cormac mac Carthay did not live to enjoy his chapel for long. He was killed in 1138, 4 years after its consecration, by enemies who were themselves the product of the violent dynastic competition that had characterized Munster politics for centuries. His sarcophagus, according to tradition, was placed in the chapel, though whether it contains Cormac's remains or those of his brother Tudg is debated. The front panel is partly damaged, but the surviving carvings show beasts intertwined in the Scandinavian Ernest style, their interlaced forms representing eternal life. Whether the sarcophagus contains Cormac's remains or those of his brother Teodg, who succeeded him, is debated. Chapter 6. The Normans arrive, and the Gothic cathedral rises, 1169 to 1300. The Norman invasion of Ireland began in 1169, when a force of Norman Welsh knights landed in County Wexford at the invitation of Diarmait mac Murchada, the exiled King of Leinster. Within 3 years, King Henry II of England had arrived in person to establish his overlordship of both the Norman settlers and the Irish kings. The Rock of Cashel was not immediately affected by this political earthquake. It was too well established as an ecclesiastical centre to be simply seized, and the Norman policy in Ireland was more nuanced than straightforward conquest. But the cultural and political consequences of the Norman arrival would eventually transform the Rock's built environment entirely. Henry II convened a Synod of Cashel in 1172, the synod that is associated with the later wall paintings in Cormac's chapel, dated to the late 1160s or early 1170s. The synod was Henry's ecclesiastical endorsement of his Irish rule. By convening a church assembly at the most sacred site in Munster, he was claiming not just political authority, but spiritual legitimacy for the Norman presence in Ireland. The connection between the 1172 synod and the Cormac's chapel paintings is speculative but suggestive. New decorative work in the chapel at the moment of Henry II's visit would have been both an assertion of the site's importance and a demonstration of its ongoing vitality as a center of ecclesiastical culture. The Gothic cathedral that now dominates the Rock, the largest structure in the complex, and the building that defines its visual character from a distance, was built in the 13th century after the Norman presence in Ireland had generated a new architectural tradition that replaced the Romanesque style of Cormac's chapel with the pointed arches, the ribbed vaulting, and the large windows of the Gothic. The Heritage Ireland leaflet records, there are no surviving records of the construction of the 13th century St. Patrick's Cathedral, and the dating evidence for this building is purely architectural. No documents. The building is its own evidence. The cathedral was built on a scale that demonstrates the Rock's continued importance as an archiepiscopal seat. The nave and choir, the transepts, the crossing tower, the full program of a Gothic cathedral, realized in the grey limestone of the Cashel Rock itself. Much of the cathedral is now a roofless shell, but the walls, nave, and choir are largely intact, and the carved stonework on the doorways and windows gives a good sense of how grand the building once was. The town of Cashel, at the foot of the Rock, was established by the archbishop sometime before 1218, and a Dominican priory followed in 1243. The rock and the town below it were developing in parallel, each needing the other. The ecclesiastical complex required a supporting population of craftsmen, traders, and minor clergy. The town required the prestige and economic activity that the archiepiscopal center generated. The Hall of the Vicar's Choral, through which visitors today enter the Rock of Cashel complex, was built in the 15th century by Archbishop Richard O'Brien, who endowed the Vicar's Choral with lands and built a hall for their accommodation. The Vicar's Choral were laymen, sometimes minor canons, appointed to assist in chanting the cathedral services, a musical institution that required both training and housing, and that gave the rock's daily life a specific sonic character: the sound of liturgical chanting from the hall above the town. The political context of the Norman period at Cashel is important to understand, because the rock's status as an archiepiscopal center gave it a specific relationship with the new power that was different from the relationship that secular Irish kingdoms had with the Normans. The Norman lords who settled across Ireland in the decades after 1169 established their own castles, towns, and administrative infrastructure, frequently at the expense of existing Irish institutions. The Church, however, was in a different position. The Normans were Catholics. They needed the Church's institutional cooperation, and they had no ideological basis for destroying ecclesiastical centers that were already operating within the Reformed Catholic tradition that the Norman settlers shared. The 1172 Synod of Cashel, convened by Henry II, was his most effective exercise of ecclesiastical legitimation. By convening a synod, a formal church assembly, at the most sacred site in Munster, Henry was positioning himself as a reformer and protector of the Irish Church rather than as a conqueror. The synod ratified a series of reforms bringing Irish practice closer to English and continental norms. The political message was clear. Henry was not replacing Irish institutions, but regularizing them in accordance with universal Catholic standards. Whether the Irish bishops at the synod believed this message or simply found it prudent to accept, it is a question of historical psychology that the surviving documents cannot fully answer. The architectural program of the 13th century, the Gothic cathedral, represents the Norman cultural influence on the rock most completely. Gothic architecture came to Ireland with the Normans. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the large decorated window were all continental imports that the Normans brought in their cultural baggage as surely as they brought feudal land tenure and castle construction. St. Patrick's Cathedral at Cashel is a thoroughly Gothic building in a specifically Irish interpretation of the style, somewhat simpler and more austere than its English or French equivalents, built from the grey local limestone rather than the more tractable stone of English Gothic construction, but unmistakably belonging to the same architectural tradition. Chapter 7. The High Cross, the Sarcophagus, and the Saints. The Rock of Cashel's physical complex, as it stood at the end of the medieval period, was one of the most architecturally dense sacred sites in Ireland. A round tower, a Romanesque chapel, a Gothic cathedral, a castle tower, a hall, a high cross, and the accumulated burial monuments, carved stones, and decorative work of 8 centuries of continuous ecclesiastical activity, all compressed onto the relatively small limestone platform at the summit. The St. Patrick's High Cross, one of the most significant of the crosses that once stood on the rock, is preserved inside the hall of the Vicar's Choral. The original cross, dating from the medieval period, has been replaced by a cast replica on its outdoor pedestal. The original is sheltered inside the hall to preserve the carved surface from further weathering. The cross represents one of the most distinctively Irish forms of religious art, the ringed high cross, a form that Ireland had been producing since the early medieval period and that had spread from Irish missionaries to other parts of the Christian world. The sarcophagus in Cormac's chapel, tradition associates it with Tadhg mac Carthag, Cormac's brother, is the most intimate piece of personal history on the rock. The front panel is partly damaged, but its carvings show beasts intertwined in the Scandinavian urn style, their interlaced forms said to represent eternal life. Urnes-style interlace, the Viking-influenced decorative tradition that appears in the stonework of 11th and 12th century Ireland, connecting a royal McCarthy tomb to the Norse cultural tradition that Brian Boru had fought at Clontarf, and that his dynasty had displaced from the Rock of Cashel. The hidden scriptorium above Cormac's Chapel, a small room where books were created and stored, connects the rock to the specifically Irish contribution to European Christian culture. The illuminated manuscript tradition that had produced the Book of Kells, the Book of Durrow, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the other masterpieces of early medieval Irish art. The scriptorium above Cormac's Chapel was not producing anything as magnificent as those 8th century works. The 12th century was not the golden age of the Irish manuscript, but its presence demonstrates that the Rock of Cashel was a center of learning and production, as well as ceremony and administration. The Castle on the Rock, a residential tower built in the 15th century by Archbishop O'Brien, forms the final element of the visible complex. By the 15th century, the distinction between an archbishop's palace and a fortified residence had largely collapsed. A powerful ecclesiastic in 15th century Ireland needed both the prestige and the defensibility of a castle, and O'Brien's contribution to the rock's built environment reflects this. The Rock of Cashel's specific genius loci, the sense of accumulated sacred significance that attaches to a site used for prayer, ceremony, and royal power for 15 centuries, is not captured by any individual building, but by the relationship between them. The round tower built just after 1101 next to the cathedral nave, Cormac's Chapel pressed against the cathedral wall at an angle that demonstrates it was already standing when the cathedral was built around it, the high cross facing the chapel doorway, the sarcophagus inside the chapel, the frescoes barely visible behind their whitewash. The whole complex is a palimpsest of sacred use, each layer visible in the stone, each layer speaking to the others across the centuries. Chapter 8. The Fitzgeralds, the Reformation, and the long 16th century, 1494 to 1600. The late 15th and 16th centuries brought the Rock of Cashel into the most turbulent period in Irish political history before the 17th century wars, a period of the Fitzgerald Earls' dominance, the Reformation's religious revolution, and the Tudor conquest that transformed Ireland's relationship with England. In 1494, the Statute of Drogheda, which aimed to subordinate the Irish Parliament to English control, was part of the broader Tudor program of extending effective royal authority over Ireland that had previously been governed largely through the great Irish and Anglo-Irish noble families. The Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare, who had dominated Irish politics for decades, were the primary target of the Tudor centralization effort. Their eventual fall in the 1530s opened a period of direct English administration that would, in the course of the century, transform Ireland's religious and political landscape. The Reformation came to Ireland in the 1530s and 1540s, when Henry VIII extended his break from Rome to his Irish kingdom. The churches and monasteries that had defined Irish religious life for 1,000 years were dissolved, their lands transferred to English settlers and loyal Irish nobles, their buildings either converted to new uses, allowed to decay, or actively demolished. The Rock of Cashel's buildings were not dissolved. They were too large and too prestigious to simply close. But the Protestant Church of Ireland that succeeded the Catholic Church as the official state religion inherited the complex, with neither the resources nor the congregational base to maintain it properly. The most consequential Reformation act for the Rock's artistic heritage was the whitewashing of the frescoes in Cormac's Chapel. The whitewashing of the frescoes, an act of iconoclasm that was standard Reformation practice across the British Isles, simultaneously destroyed the visual experience of the chapel and, paradoxically, preserved the paintings by protecting them from the weathering and vandalism that exposed surfaces would have suffered over the subsequent centuries. Another architectural consequence of this period, the north portal of Cormac's Chapel, originally the main entrance, considerably more elaborate than the south door, was permanently blocked when St. Patrick's Cathedral was built across it. The cathedral was built so close to Cormac's Chapel on its north side that the original main entrance became inaccessible from outside. The two buildings, chapel and cathedral, pressed against each other in the limited space of the limestone platform, the later building surrounding the earlier one, making the older building both preserved within and somewhat imprisoned by the newer construction. The Reformation's specific impact on the Rock of Cashel was not the physical destruction of buildings, that would come later, from war rather than religious revolution, but the break in the tradition of use and maintenance that had sustained the complex for 4 centuries. The Catholic priests, monks, and canons who had administered the cathedral maintained the buildings, celebrated the daily round of liturgical services, and kept the memory of the site's sacred history alive, were expelled, scattered, or converted. Their replacements, Protestant clergy of the Church of Ireland, were typically fewer in number, less connected to the specific cultural traditions of the site, and operating in an institutional context that did not always see the maintenance of medieval Catholic architecture as a priority. The Protestant Church of Ireland's relationship with the Rock of Cashel through the 16th and 17th centuries was one of awkward stewardship rather than active development. The buildings were used, the cathedral remained the church of the Archbishop of Cashel, but they were not invested in or extended. The specifically Catholic artistic tradition that had produced Cormac's Chapel and its frescoes, the Gothic stonework of the cathedral doorways and windows, the carved figures and heraldic devices of the 15th century additions, all of these were now either actively condemned as papist idolatry or simply neglected as irrelevant to a Protestant congregation's worship. The Fitzgeralds, who dominated much of Irish politics in the 16th century before the Tudor conquest ended their power, maintained connections to Munster and to Cashel, but the specific architectural and institutional investment that had characterized the medieval archbishop's relationship with the Rock did not survive the political upheaval of the Reformation period. The last significant medieval building on the Rock, Archbishop O'Hedian's Hall of the Vicar's Choral, predated the Reformation by nearly a century. Nothing comparable was added afterward. Chapter 9, Murrough of the Burnings, the Massacre of 1647. The most violent episode in the Rock of Cashel's history took place on September 15, 1647, when Murrough O'Brien, Baron of Inchiquin and Parliamentarian commander in Munster, led his forces in the sack of the Rock. The context was the Irish Confederate Wars, the Irish dimension of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms that simultaneously convulsed England, Scotland, and Ireland in the 1640s. The Irish Catholic Confederacy, formed in 1641, had been fighting for Catholic and Royalist interests against the Protestant English Parliament. Munster was one of the theatres of this conflict, and Inchiquin commanded the Protestant parliamentary forces in the province. Lord Tough, the Confederate commander, had placed 6 companies in the fortified churchyard on the Rock, and considered the place defensible, though he himself did not stay to test this, leaving command to Lieutenant Colonel Butler. The garrison was real, and the Rock's natural defensibility had not diminished. The limestone outcrop was as difficult to assault as it had always been. But Inchiquin's forces had already demonstrated their ruthlessness by storming Roch Castle and putting 50 warders to the sword, terrifying the local population. The attack was one of the most brutal incidents of the 1640s wars in Ireland. The army burned the defences, massacred soldiers, civilians, and priests, and desecrated St. Patrick's Cathedral. The plunder that followed was extensive: pictures, chalices, vestments, and the valuables that panicked civilians had carried to the Rock, believing it safe. The sword and mace of the mayor of Cashel and the bishop's coach were among the documented seizures. The statues were smashed. The pictures were defaced. The sacred objects accumulated over centuries of ecclesiastical use were carried off. The massacre had profound political ramifications within the Irish Confederation, deepening the split between the Catholic party headed by the papal nuncio Giovanni Battista Rinuccini and those sympathetic to the royalist Lord Ormond. The massacre at Cashel, at one of the chief holy places of Irish Catholicism, deepened the fractures within the Confederate movement at exactly the moment when unity was most needed. The atrocity caused a deep impact in Ireland as the worst single incident since the fighting began in 1641, and it occurred at one of the chief holy places in the country. 1,000 years of sacred history, 200 years of ecclesiastical building, the most important Romanesque chapel in Ireland, the Gothic cathedral of an archbishopric, all of it desecrated, plundered, and left in ruins by a Protestant commander whose own family name, O'Brien, connected him directly to the dynasty that had been coronated at this site 6 centuries earlier. Murrough O'Brien converted to Catholicism in 1656. He died in 1673 and is buried at St. Mary's Cathedral in Limerick. His nickname, Murchad ne Doitean, Murrough of the Burnings, endured. The scale of what was lost is difficult to quantify precisely. The civic and episcopal symbols of authority, the formal trappings of the towns and the archbishop's power carried to the rock in the assumption that it was safe. They were not. The chalices and vestments represent something different. The liturgical objects of the Catholic Mass, the material through which the central ritual of Irish Catholic religious life was performed. Chalices especially, the sacred vessels used to contain the consecrated wine, were often among the most valuable portable objects that an Irish Catholic community possessed, made of gold or silver, frequently decorated with enamel and precious stones, and representing generations of devotional investment. Their removal from Cashel was both economically valuable and symbolically devastating. The instruments of the Mass could no longer be celebrated at the most sacred site in Munster. The iconoclasm, the smashing of statues, the defacing of images, was equally deliberate. Protestant Reformation theology held that religious images were at best distractions from pure worship and at worst idolatrous abominations. The practice of destroying Catholic religious art, which had been a feature of the English and Scottish Reformations, was carried out by Inchiquin's forces as a theological statement as well as an act of military destruction. The carved figures, the painted images, the devotional objects that had accumulated at Cashel over centuries of Catholic use were deliberately removed from a landscape of sacred significance that Protestant theology rejected. The atrocity remained in Irish Catholic memory for centuries. Its significance was not merely quantitative, the number of dead, but symbolic. The violation of Ireland's most sacred royal and ecclesiastical site by a man who bore the name of the dynasty that had been crowned there. Chapter 10. Abandoned by the Archbishop. The End of Active Use. 1647 to 1749. The 1647 massacre effectively ended the Rock of Cashel's function as a working ecclesiastical center. The damage done by Inchiquin's forces, the plundering of valuables, the destruction of furnishings and fixtures, the desecration of the sacred spaces, left the complex in a state that required substantial restoration to be functional again. In a period of continuous warfare and economic devastation, that restoration never came. The Protestant Church of Ireland, which nominally held the Rock after the Reformation, was an institution whose relationship with the site was already awkward. A Protestant church administering a site whose entire historical significance was Catholic, using a building whose architecture, imagery, and accumulated sacred associations were all expressions of the Catholic tradition that the Reformation had officially replaced. The Cathedral of Cashel remained in Church of Ireland use through the 17th century, but the resources devoted to its maintenance were minimal. The decisive moment came in 1749. The rock had been in Protestant Church of Ireland use since the Reformation, but in that year it was abandoned. The reason recorded is both mundane and extraordinary. The Archbishop of Cashel found it too cold for comfort. The Archbishop of Cashel, in 1749, found the medieval cathedral on the top of a limestone rock in County Tipperary too cold for comfort, and he transferred the cathedral services to a new building in the town below. The abandonment of the Rock of Cashel as an active religious site after approximately 15 centuries of continuous sacred use was the consequence of an 18th-century prelate's preference for better heating. The rock was left to the winds and the rains and the gradual deterioration of an unroofed building in the Irish climate. The Cathedral of St. Patrick's, which had been roofless since at least the 1647 damage, if not earlier, continued to lose stonework, internal fixtures, and the decorative elements that required maintenance to survive. The round tower, being simpler in construction and without a roof to fail, survived better than the more complex buildings. Cormac's Chapel, being relatively small and having survived the 1647 sacking in better condition than the cathedral, also retained more of its fabric. The gradual decay of the rock through the 18th and 19th centuries was part of the broader pattern of Irish heritage loss during this period. Hundreds of medieval buildings, churches, monasteries, tower houses, abbeys, were losing their roofs, their furnishings, and their decorative elements to weather, stone robbing, and neglect. The Rock of Cashel, given its size and its prominence, attracted visitors throughout this period. Artists came to sketch the ruins, travelers came to contemplate the romantic decay, and the tradition of the site's sacred significance was maintained in the collective memory of the local community, even as its physical condition deteriorated. The discovery of the Cormac's Chapel frescoes in the 1980s, emerging from beneath the whitewash applied in the 16th century, was the most significant archaeological revelation of the site's modern history. Conservation work undertaken since then has partially stabilized the paintings, which remain among the most important medieval wall paintings in Ireland, even in their damaged state. The rock, in the 18th and 19th centuries, attracted a different kind of attention from its earlier royal and ecclesiastical visitors. Antiquarians, artists, poets, and early tourists made it a standard destination on any tour of Munster. The ruins were large enough to be visually impressive, historically significant enough to be intellectually interesting, and romantic enough in their decay to satisfy the Romantic movement's appetite for the beautiful desolation of the past. The same cultural dynamic that made Edinburgh's ruined castles and the Rhine's crumbling towers into tourist destinations also made the Rock of Cashel one. The connection between the 1749 abandonment and the subsequent transformation of the rock into a heritage site is straightforward. The archbishop who found the medieval cathedral too cold for comfort created, unintentionally, the condition under which the rock became permanently available as a subject for romantic contemplation rather than a functioning place of worship. A working cathedral with a congregation, heating, and regular maintenance would have been far less photogenic and would have prevented many of the conservation interventions that have attempted to stabilize the existing fabric. The Office of Public Works, the Irish state agency responsible for national monuments, has managed the Rock of Cashel since its transfer to state care. The conservation challenges are formidable. A complex of medieval limestone buildings, some roofed and some open to the sky, exposed to the Atlantic weather that sweeps across the Golden Vale from the west, subject to the specific deterioration mechanisms of Irish limestone in a wet climate. The conservation of Cormac's Chapel is particularly demanding. The building's unusual combination of a partly vaulted roof and highly detailed carved surfaces makes it vulnerable to moisture in ways that require continuous monitoring and intervention. The rock remains one of the most visited heritage sites in Ireland. Its combination of historical significance, visual drama, and architectural quality, the round tower, the chapel, the cathedral, all on their grey limestone platform against the Tipperary sky, makes it one of the essential Irish experiences for visitors from around the world. Chapter 11. What the Rock Means. Ireland's sacred site in the modern world. The Rock of Cashel is managed today by the Office of Public Works under the Irish State's Heritage Agency, Historic Ireland. It receives several 100,000 visitors each year, making it one of the most visited sites in Ireland. The approach to it, from the town of Cashel, looking up at the limestone outcrop with its medieval buildings silhouetted against the sky, is one of the most dramatic heritage experiences available anywhere in the country. The accumulated layers of meaning at the rock are genuinely extraordinary in their compression. The legend of St. Patrick and King Angus connects the site to the deepest strata of Irish Christian identity. The inauguration of Brian Boru connects it to the most celebrated secular ruler in Irish history. The 1101 donation connects it to the transformation of Irish Christianity into an internationally connected institutional church. Cormac's Chapel connects it to the finest achievement of Irish Romanesque art. The 1647 massacre connects it to the worst atrocities of the 17th century wars that defined modern Ireland's relationship with England and with its own past. The 2015 Geophysical Survey, the Defining the Rock of Cashel project, led by Patrick Gleeson, identified subsurface structures that suggest the early medieval complex was considerably larger and more complex than the surviving above-ground buildings indicate. The rock is an archaeological site as well as an architectural one, and the buried evidence of 15 centuries of occupation is only partially understood. The relationship between the rock and the town of Cashel below it remains one of the defining features of the visit. The town exists in the visual shadow of the rock, its streets and buildings oriented toward the limestone outcrop that rises above them. The bishops who administered the archdiocese from the medieval cathedral, the townspeople who sheltered on the rock in 1647, believing it would protect them, the archbishop who abandoned the cold cathedral in 1749 and moved to more comfortable premises below. All of these figure in the relationship between the elevated sacred site and the ordinary human community that has always lived under it. The Leofile legend, the screaming stone that announced the rightful king, endures in the local tradition associated with the rock, though the specific stone is no longer identified. The Devil's Bit mountain is visible on the horizon to the north, its distinctive notch in the ridge still legible as the source of the limestone chunk that the legend says the devil spat southward. The crozier that Patrick pressed into King Angus's foot is long gone, but the foot of the story is still felt in the way the Irish tradition relates to this place, as the site of Ireland's first encounter between royal power and Christian faith. 3 different buildings on the rock represent 3 different centuries: the Round Tower for the 11th, Cormac's Chapel for the 12th, the Cathedral for the 13th. 3 different dynasties presided over their construction: the Uí Briain for the tower, the McCarthy for the chapel, the archbishops of the Norman period for the cathedral. 3 different political events defined the rock's history: the gift of 1101, the synods of 1111 and 1172, and the massacre of 1647. And underneath all of it, the limestone rock that the devil bit from a mountain and spat across 20 miles of Irish countryside, where the rightful king's stone screamed, where the saint's crozier pierced the foot of the first Christian king of Munster, where 1,000 years of sacred history are compressed into a platform 60 meters above the Golden Veil. The Rock of Cashel is, in the most concentrated possible form, the story of Ireland. Its kings gave it away, its saints sanctified it, its builders created masterpieces within it. Its conquerors tried to burn it. The building that survived all of this, the small Romanesque chapel that a McCarthy king built as a statement of power after 150 years of his family's exile from their ancestral seat, whose frescoes were hidden under whitewash for 4 centuries and survived, whose sarcophagus contains either the king's bones or his brothers', whose north doorway was buried under a later cathedral, is the most moving thing on the rock. Cormac MacCarthy was killed 4 years after his chapel was consecrated. He never knew what it would become. He only knew that the rock had been his family's seat, that it had been taken from them, and that building the finest piece of architecture in Ireland upon it was the most eloquent possible statement that they were not entirely gone. The spatial relationship between the different buildings on the rock is one of its most revealing features. The round tower stands at the north side of the cathedral, connected to but separate from the nave wall. Built first when the cathedral did not yet exist, positioned to face the west end of the earlier 12th century cathedral rather than the Gothic structure that replaced it. The cathedral was built to the north of Cormac's chapel, so close that the chapel's north doorway, its original main entrance, more elaborate than the south door, became inaccessible from outside. The hall of the vicar's choral was built at the southeast edge of the platform, providing an entry point into the complex as well as accommodation for its musical establishment. This spatial accumulation, each building positioned in relation to what was already there, constrained by the limited area of the limestone platform, generating the compressed and slightly disorienting experience that visitors have when they move between the different structures today, is exactly what gives the Rock of Cashel its distinctive character. It is not a planned complex like a Gothic cathedral close or a monastery quadrangle. It is an accretion of buildings, each added when the moment required it, each adjusting to the presence of its predecessors. The result is a site that can only be understood in motion, walking from the tower to the chapel to the cathedral, discovering the angles at which the buildings meet, reading the sequence of building campaigns in the different stonework and architectural styles. The hall of the vicar's choral, through which visitors now enter, contains a small museum of objects excavated on the rock. These artifacts, the physical detritus of centuries of sacred use, include objects from multiple periods of the rock's occupation and represent the accumulated evidence of the site's use that the buildings themselves cannot contain. The museum in the hall provides the horizontal access to Cashel's history that the vertical view from the cathedral tower provides spatially, a way to see the whole before exploring the parts. The St. Patrick's Cross, the High Cross whose replica now stands outside and whose original is inside the hall, is a final element of the complex that connects the site to the broader tradition of Irish Christian art. The high cross form, tall stone cross with a ringed head, carved with biblical scenes on one face and abstract interlace on the other, was one of the most original contributions of Irish Christianity to the visual arts of medieval Europe, and the Cashel cross is one of its distinguished examples. The cross stood in the open, exposed to the full force of the Tipperary climate and the centuries of use and misuse that followed, before being preserved indoors with a cast replacement taking its outdoor position. Chapter 12. They be on Rock in summary: 3 dynasties, 3 buildings, 3 events. The Rock of Cashel's history can be compressed into 3 buildings, 3 dynasties, and 3 decisive events. The 3 buildings: the Round Tower, built just after 1101, the practical and symbolic first marker of the rock's transformation from royal fortress to ecclesiastical centre. Cormac's Chapel, built 1127 to 1134. The architectural masterpiece that is both the finest Romanesque building in Ireland and a McCarthy king's political statement of endurance. And the Cathedral of St. Patrick, built in the 13th century, the Gothic monument to the archiepiscopal authority that the 1111 Synod had established at Cashel. The 3 dynasties, the Eoganacht, who held the rock from approximately the 4th century to the late 10th century, whose legacy is St. Patrick's baptism of King Angus and 6 centuries of Munster kingship. The Dalcais, whose leader Brian Boru transformed the rock from a provincial seat into the home fortress of Ireland's only genuine High King, and whose heir Murrough gave it to the Church, and the McCarthy, whose greatest king built the finest building on the rock as a statement of survival, and whose people were massacred on it in 1647. The 3 decisive events, the 1101 donation, which simultaneously transformed the site and prevented a rival dynasty from ever reclaiming it. The 1134 consecration of Cormac's Chapel, which created a masterpiece that survived the Reformation's whitewash and the 17th century's violence, and the 1647 massacre, which desecrated the most sacred site in Munster at the hands of a man who bore the name of the dynasty that had been crowned there. The devil bit a chunk from a mountain 20 miles to the north and spat it south. A saint chased him to it. A king was baptized there with a crozier through his foot. The stone screamed when the rightful king sat on it. An archbishop gave it to the church to prevent his enemies from having it. A McCarthy king built a chapel on it as a statement that his family was not entirely finished. An archbishop called it too cold. A man named O'Brien massacred the clergy of the O'Brien dynasty's founding site, and the buildings remain, grey against the Tipperary sky, the most concentrated accumulation of Irish sacred history anywhere on the island.